I stood in that cold conference room holding the forged papers Mark thought I would never see. The banker looked at me and asked if I had approved moving my wife's $30 million trust while she was lying in the ICU. I remember my voice dropping slow and steady as I told them I had never signed anything. Mark's face went pale. Everything he tried to hide was about to surface. If you are watching this video, remember to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Now, let me take you back to how all of this began. When I think back to that moment in the bank, the room felt small, almost airless. But the truth is, the story did not begin there. It began weeks earlier in the quiet rhythm of my life before everything shifted. My name is David Turner. I am 62 years old, a retired aerospace engineer. I have lived in the same Michigan town for most of my life. The winters are long here, and the cold has a way of settling into the bones of every house. That year, the snow stayed longer than usual. It piled along the fences, gathered on the roofs, and turned the whole street into shades of white and gray. Our home felt peaceful, steady, familiar. My wife, Linda, is 58, gentle, thoughtful, always the one who remembered birthdays and neighbors' names. Her family left her a large trust many years ago, around $30 million. She never flaunted it. She never treated it like a trophy. It was simply part of her life and ours. We lived modestly. We cared more about quiet mornings than anything money could buy. We have one daughter, Emily. She is 35 and has always been the softest part of our home. She married a man named Mark Evans. He was polite, the kind of person who smiles quickly and talks carefully. On the surface, he seemed helpful, supportive. In truth, I never felt at ease around him. There was something in his eyes, something watchful, something that made me feel as if he was always calculating the value of everything around him. Still, for Emily's sake, I kept my distance and tried to believe that time would settle the unease. Life felt stable. We woke to quiet mornings. Linda cooked slow breakfasts. Emily visited often. Even Mark would sit at our table, sipping coffee and asking about projects around the house. It was a steady stretch of days, the kind you do not realize you will miss until they are gone. Everything changed one evening near the end of winter. Linda collapsed in our living room. One moment she was laughing softly at a story I was telling, and the next her breath slipped, her face drained of color, and she fell against the sofa. The sound of her body hitting the cushions still echoes in my mind. I called for help, trying to keep calm, trying to keep my voice steady. But inside, something broke. The ambulance arrived. The cold air rushed into the house as they carried her out. I remember standing there watching the snow swirl around the flashing lights, feeling as if the world had tilted. At the hospital, the doctors told us she had severe cardiac complications. They moved her to the ICU. They said they needed quiet control, minimal stress. Emily tried to be strong, but she had been struggling for some time after her own difficult postpartum period. The doctors gently told her she should not expose herself to more pressure. That left only one option for the ICU's single-visitor rule. Mark, he stepped forward as if he had been waiting for the role. He told us he could handle everything. He told Emily to rest. He told me he would stay by Linda's side. I nodded because I had no other choice. But what I did not know then, as the door closed behind him, was that this was the moment his plan quietly began. The moment he realized he had access. The moment he understood no one would question him. And the moment my peaceful life started to fracture in ways I could not yet see. Those first nights in the ICU felt long and heavy. The halls were dim, and every sound seemed sharper, like the world had gone quiet, just to make room for worry. I spent most of my time in the waiting area, staring at the double doors that led into the unit. Only one visitor was allowed inside. Only one person could sit beside Linda, and because of Emily's fragile state, that person was Mark. He moved in and out of the ICU with a rhythm that made me uneasy. Early morning, midday, late at night. Each time he walked through those doors, he acted as if he carried a burden no one else could handle. But when he walked back out, something about him felt different. His eyes were sharper, his steps quicker, and every time he looked at me, I felt as if he was measuring something I could not see. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, fear, fatigue. Families change when someone is fighting for their life. But deep inside, a quiet tension began to form, a tension I could not explain. Then came the moment that shifted everything. It was nearly midnight. The nurses were changing shifts. I was sitting alone trying to steady my breathing when Mark stepped into the waiting room. He lowered himself into the seat beside me. He didn't look tired. He didn't look worried. He looked focused. He said in a calm voice, "Dad, the doctor said your wife might not make it. Don't you think we should start organizing the financial paperwork?" For a second I could not speak. The words hung in the air between us. Cold, flat, empty of any kind of grief. Financial paperwork. Linda was unconscious, fighting to stay alive. And he was thinking about accounts and documents. The room felt colder. My hands tightened on the armrest. I looked at him waiting, hoping to see some sign of sorrow, some hint of fear for her. But there was nothing. Only calculation. I told him we would talk later. My voice was steady, but inside, something cracked. A quiet fear. A quiet warning. I felt it in my chest, like a slow pulse. I did not know it then, but that moment was the first small opening into the plan he had already begun to build. A plan far larger than a casual question. A plan that needed Linda helpless and me distracted. And as I watched him walk back toward the ICU doors, I felt a chill run through me. A deep sense that something was moving under the surface of our lives. Something I could not yet name. After that night, something inside me stayed alert. I could not shake Mark's tone when he mentioned financial paperwork. It echoed in the back of my mind like a quiet warning. I tried to tell myself I was tired, overwhelmed, imagining things. But the truth was simpler. His words had revealed something I had sensed for years. A part of him was waiting, watching, calculating. And now, with Linda unconscious, he finally saw an opening. I told myself to stay calm, to stay steady. I needed to protect Linda, and I needed to keep Emily from more stress. But it became harder with each passing day, because the more time Mark spent inside the ICU, the more he began to move in ways that felt wrong. It started with small things, small comments, small moments, small changes in his behavior that most people would overlook. But I noticed every one of them because I was looking closely now. Level 1 was simple, hurtful words, wrapped in soft tones. Whenever he came out of the ICU, he would speak to me with a strange mix of sympathy and certainty. "David," he said one morning, "the doctor said the odds are not good. We should think about the future. For Emily, for the family." He kept circling the same ideas. Future planning, inheritance, preparation. Not once did he say he hoped she would wake up. Not once did he say he missed her voice. He spoke about my wife as if she were already gone, as if her life could be reduced to documents and signatures. Emily felt it too. She came to the hospital as often as she could, though she stayed outside the ICU. One afternoon she sat beside me and whispered, "Dad, why does he talk like she's not coming back?" Her voice shook, and I saw the old strain return to her face. She had fought so hard to pull herself out of the fog left by her postpartum struggles. She had been healing, slowly. But Mark's comments began to press on her again, adding weight she didn't know how to carry. I held her hand and told her to focus on herself. I told her to breathe, but even as I tried to calm her, I felt the same cold question rising inside me. Why was he speaking as if he was preparing for something? Level 2 came without warning. He started bringing me documents, forms he printed, papers he said Linda would want settled. One evening he handed me a small stack of papers and said, "Just sign these for convenience." Convenience. That was the word he used. I looked at the papers. The wording was vague, too vague. Things like authorization and temporary control. There were blank fields, lines left open. It felt wrong. I told him I would review everything later, slowly, carefully. His jaw tightened. His smile faded for a moment, only for a second. But I saw it. A crack in the polite mask he always wore. He said, "David, we don't have time for slow decisions." He spoke as if he had the right to rush me, as if the situation belonged to him. I refused to sign anything. He did not hide his irritation. He folded the papers sharply and tucked them away. But the look he gave me afterward, that look stayed with me. It was cold, not angry, not emotional, just cold. Level 3 followed quietly, and it was worse. He started acting like he had authority inside the ICU. He pushed nurses to let him stay longer. He asked about Linda's medication schedule, her sedation level, her access points. He began hovering over her personal items, her bag, her coat, even the folder she kept with old trust paperwork. One afternoon, a nurse approached me in the hallway. Her voice was low, careful. She said, "Mr. Turner, I think you should know something. My heart tightened. She continued. Earlier today, your son-in-law asked about using a sedated patient's fingerprint to authorize documents. He said it was for medical consent, but it did not sound right. I felt the ground shift beneath me. I thanked her gently. She looked relieved, as if she had been carrying that worry for hours. That was the moment I began to understand. His presence in the ICU was not about care. It was not about support. It was about opportunity. He was looking for a way to access something, to reach something, to use something. I did not yet know that he was targeting the trust, but I knew now something was very wrong. Level 4 came through my daughter. Emily visited me one afternoon, her eyes red, her voice shaking. She sat beside me and whispered, "Dad." Mark said, "Mom had a new investment. Something urgent. Something that needs signatures. He said you should help him because she might not be able to." Her fingers twisted in her lap. "Is that true? Did Mom tell you anything?" I felt a slow, deep anger rise inside me. Not loud, not wild, just steady, like a quiet flame. "No," I told her. "Your mother did not start anything new." Emily looked down as if the truth she feared had finally touched her. She said, "Dad, I think he's lying to me." I placed a hand on her shoulder. I told her she was not imagining it. Her relief was immediate, but behind it was something else. "Fear?" she asked. "What does he want?" I did not want to scare her. "Not yet," I simply said. "Something he should never touch." Level 5 arrived in the early morning darkness. My phone rang at dawn. The sky was still the color of ash. I answered, expecting a nurse, a doctor, a simple update. Instead, a voice introduced itself from the bank. "Mr. Turner, we need to confirm a request to transfer your wife's entire $30 million trust to Mr. Mark Evans." "Did you authorize this?" For a moment I could not speak. My breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. My wife was unconscious, sedated, fighting for her life, and my son-in-law was moving her trust. The trust her parents built, the trust she guarded, the trust he had no claim to. My hands trembled. My voice came slow. "No," I said. "No, I did not authorize anything." The banker hesitated. "Someone submitted documents. We were told you approved it." The room around me felt distant. The world outside the hospital windows blurred. Everything narrowed to a single truth. He had done it, or at least, he had tried. I hung up the call and sat very still. This was no misunderstanding, no paperwork mix-up, no confusion at the worst moment. This was a plan, a deliberate act, a betrayal that reached deeper than anything I had imagined. And as I stared at the floor, one thought filled my mind. I had witnessed the lowest point of betrayal in my family, but I also realized something else, something quiet, something important. The beginning of my revenge had just opened its eyes, and I was not going to let him touch another inch of our lives. I did not move for a long time after that call. The hospital lights hummed above me, and the early morning air felt sharp in my lungs. I kept replaying the banker's words, the calm tone he used when he asked if I had approved a transfer that would have erased Linda's entire trust. It didn't feel real, but it was, and somewhere inside the shock, a quiet clarity began to form. A few hours later, my phone rang again. This time, it was a different banker. Her voice was softer, cautious, almost as if she was choosing every word with care. "Mr. Turner, I'm calling you privately," she said. "Something about the documents your son-in-law submitted seems wrong." My grip on the phone tightened. She continued, "The signatures look copied, and the person who brought them in said you agreed, but misplaced the original papers." I felt a slow chill settle in my chest. I asked her who first noticed the problem. There was a small pause before she answered. It was our compliance director, Linda Harrington. The name hit me like a sudden light in a dark room. Linda Harrington, my wife's old high school friend. Someone she trusted. Someone who had always stayed in touch through holiday cards and quiet updates. She had recognized something that didn't fit, and she stepped in before the transfer could go through. Within minutes, she sent me a scanned copy of the documents Mark had submitted. I opened the file on my phone. The room around me faded. The forms filled the screen. At the bottom, I saw my wife's signature, except it wasn't hers. Not even close. The lines were shaky, the curves wrong. It looked like someone had copied it from an old document and tried to reshape it. Then I saw mine, my own signature, Seeing my name forged was like being struck in the chest. There was a strange, quiet anger in that moment. Not loud, not wild, just deep, steady, like a door closing inside me. Mark had forged both our signatures. He had walked into a bank, with papers he made, while my wife was unconscious, and tried to take everything her parents left her. I sat very still, staring at the screen, letting the truth settle. This was not desperation. This was not panic. This was planning, calculation, a long, steady line of choices he had made with a clear goal. And if I exploded now, if I confronted him in anger, if I showed even a flicker of what I had discovered, he would pull back. He would hide. He would move in shadows I could not reach. So, I made a decision. Silence would be my greatest weapon. I closed the file and placed the phone in my coat pocket. My hands were steady, my breath slow. I knew at that moment that the rules had changed. I was no longer just protecting my wife. I was preparing for the end of his plan and the beginning of mine. I walked out of the hospital that morning with a calm I did not entirely understand. The air was cold, still, almost too quiet. I held my phone in my pocket, the forged documents still open in my mind. Every curve of the fake signatures, every line he tried to use against us. I felt none of the panic I expected, only focus. I knew then that the next moves he made would tell me everything. And I needed him to believe I was tired, overwhelmed, drifting. I needed him relaxed, confident, unaware that the ground under his feet had already begun to shift. When I returned to the ICU waiting area, Mark was already there. He looked up from his phone, surprised to see how calm I was. He expected anger, questions, confrontation. Instead, I lowered myself into the chair beside him and said quietly, "You handle the financial stuff. I'm too tired." He blinked. Once, twice. Then he smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a polite one. A small smile of relief, as if the final barrier in his way had just fallen. He said, "Don't worry, I've got this." Those words settled in the room like dust. Slow, soft, dangerous. I nodded, pretending to agree, pretending to surrender. Inside, I knew I had just given him the confidence he needed to expose every step of his plan. The hours that followed were spent gathering what I needed. The compliance director, Linda's old friend, sent me the full set of documents Mark submitted. Originals, copies, timestamps. She even included the internal notes written by the staff who flagged his request. Every detail mattered now. Then I called Linda's trust attorney, a careful, patient man who had managed her family's estate for decades. He reviewed the documents in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "David, these forms cannot be authorized. Not legally, not by a spouse, not even with power of attorney. What he attempted is not only invalid, it's intentional fraud." Those words steadied me further. Next came the hospital. I asked for written proof of Linda's sedation level at the exact time Mark claimed she approved the paperwork. The nurse who had warned me earlier helped gather the documents. She even added her own incident note, the one describing how he asked about using a sedated patient's fingerprint. Piece by piece, the truth was building itself into something solid, something undeniable. But none of this would matter if he sensed even a hint of what I was doing. He needed to trust my exhaustion, my silence, my confusion. So I allowed myself to look worn, distracted, uncertain. He watched me closely for the rest of the day. He kept checking on me, asking if I needed rest or food or a break. Not out of care, but out of caution. He wanted to be sure I was still weak enough to ignore what he was doing. I made myself smaller, slower, quieter. And in that quiet, he grew bolder. The next day, I stopped by Emily's house. She looked tired, withdrawn, unsure of how to navigate the strange tension between her mother's illness and her husband's behavior. I did not want to burden her with details she wasn't ready to hear, so I guided her gently. I told her she deserved space from stress. I encouraged her to return to therapy. I reminded her that her own healing mattered just as much as Linda's. She asked me, "Dad, do you think Mark is handling things the right way?" I paused, then answered softly, "I think you need time to think on your own." Without pressure, she nodded. It was exactly what she needed to hear, and it created the distance I needed. The less time she spent with him, the fewer chances he had to manipulate her or pull her into his plans. When I later returned to the hospital, the ICU nurse who had spoken to me earlier met me in the hallway again. She looked uneasy but determined. She said, "If you need an official report, I will sign one." What he asked me about was not normal. Her willingness gave me another piece of the puzzle. Another voice. Another witness. By the end of the week, I had gathered everything. Documents, statements, proof, analysis, reports. But the most important piece, the one that would silence him when the time came, was something I never planned for. The recording. I had forgotten about it at first. It was automatic. My phone had been set to record incoming calls for years, a habit from my engineering days. And earlier, when Mark had tried to pressure me into signing for convenience, the entire conversation had been recorded without me even thinking about it. I listened to it late one night, alone in my car outside the hospital. The words played through the speakers calm and clear. "Just sign these. For convenience. It's simple, David. No need to complicate things. We need this done quickly." Hearing his voice like that, calm, confident, certain he could push me, made something settle deep inside me. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet purpose. I had everything I needed now. Every move he made, every lie he told, every attempt to control the situation. All of it was documented. But the most important thing was that he believed none of it existed. He believed I was tired, defeated, dependent on him. He walked through the hospital halls with ease now. He spoke to nurses with authority. He treated the trust as if it was already his. He acted as though the world had already tilted in his favor. He had no idea the ground he walked on was already cracked. No idea that every step he took, every word he said, every forged line he created, was leading him into a corner he would never escape. And as I sat beside Linda, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest, I whispered quietly in my mind, not to her, but to myself. He has no idea what is coming. He has no idea that the person he thought was weakest was the one who had already begun to dismantle his entire plan. He had no idea that the trap had already been built, and all that was left was for him to walk into it. I walked out of the visitor room with my mother's words running loops in my mind, each one landing heavier than the last. Down the sterile hallway, the sound of the ICU machines faded, replaced by that quiet, steady hum hospitals always fall into at night. I held Mark's notebook under my arm, the pages warm from my hands, the confessions inside already reshaping everything I thought I knew. I did not go home. Not yet. I drove to the only place that made sense at that moment, my office. The building was half lit, the parking lot nearly empty, and the security guard barely looked up when I walked in. Maybe he sensed something in my expression because he didn't even ask why I was showing up close to midnight. Inside my office, I locked the door, pulled the blinds, and sat at my desk. I opened the notebook again, this time slower, letting each line settle. The entries were written in his rushed handwriting, slanted, cramped, almost like he was afraid someone would look over his shoulder. One page held a sentence that stopped me. I thought I could handle the pressure. I thought the trust would save me. It wasn't crossed out. It wasn't scribbled over. It was clean, intentional. I closed my eyes and leaned back, trying to reconcile this version of Mark with the version I had been fighting for weeks, the defiant one, always pushing, always smiling like he knew he had won. The one who forged signatures. The one who moved money while his wife was unconscious in the ICU. But the man behind these pages, he was scared, desperate, cornered, and in some twisted way he sounded almost human. That did not justify anything he had done, but it revealed something I could finally use, because power comes from understanding what the other side fears most. I went through the pages again, finding a rhythm in the silence. Every entry painted the same picture, mounting debt, risky investments, and the trust he planned to access as a lifeline. He had set everything in motion months before the ICU incident, long before the medical emergency, long before he claimed he was doing it for her. I kept reading until I reached the final entry, the one dated only a few days before tonight. They will see me as a monster, but I didn't intend for it to go this far. The words were uneven, pressed down so hard they almost tore the page. I had to steady my breath after finishing it, because in that moment I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider. Someone else might have been pulling strings behind Mark. Someone who knew about the trust, someone who knew about the debts, someone who benefited from keeping him quiet, and someone who was counting on me, focusing only on him. I sat there in the dark office, my finger tracing the edge of the page, feeling that shift inside me, the moment when suspicion becomes direction. I needed a name, a pattern, a clue, and I found it in the margins of the notebook, almost hidden under a fold. A set of initials, just 2 letters, repeated several times. E. M. I stared at them, trying to recall anyone connected to our family or the trust documents with those initials. The more I searched my memory, the more a certain face began to form, one I hadn't thought about in years. Someone who had always been around the edges, always polite, always invisible in the places where real decisions were made. By the time I closed the notebook, I had a direction, and direction is the first step to dismantling someone's confidence. I turned off the office lights, walked to my car, and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. Outside, the city was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like the moment before a storm shifts. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night, not with the truth sitting so close. So I drove to the bank, not inside, just the parking lot. I parked near the back, looking up at the dark windows, where the trust department worked during the day. I traced back every meeting, every signature review, every staff rotation. That name, the one connected to those initials, kept resurfacing. I finally whispered it out loud, and hearing it gave the moment weight. Everything was starting to point in one direction. And for the first time, the path ahead felt sharper, clearer. This was no longer just about Mark's betrayal. It was about someone who thought they were safe. Someone who believed I would stop once I saw the notebook. They were wrong. I tightened my grip on the notebook beside me. Tomorrow, I would confront the person behind those initials. I would peel back the last layer of this mess, and I would do it without hesitation. Mark had set the first fire, but someone else, someone far smarter, had poured the fuel, and I was finally ready to strike the match. The next morning arrived with a brittle calm, the kind that settles in only after the truth has already done its damage. By the time I walked into the trust office, notebook in hand, the board had already gathered. They had reviewed the forged signatures, the unauthorized transfers, and the detailed timeline I had built from Mark's own words. There was no debate, no hesitation. Mark was removed from the trust permanently. His name was struck from every document, every clause, every future distribution. It was as if he had never been part of it at all. Watching the legal director initial the final page felt strangely quiet, almost anticlimactic, yet it marked the first clean boundary we had drawn since this began. When I returned to the hospital, Emily was awake enough to understand what happened. She read the summary of the board's decision with trembling hands. For a long time she didn't speak, only looked out the window toward the parking lot where snow from the early storm had begun to drift in slow, unhurried waves. Then, with a voice that was softer than I expected, she told me she was filing for divorce. Not out of anger, she said, out of self-preservation. Some betrayals are too tightly woven into someone's character to be undone. The papers were filed the same week. Mark was served while staying in a hotel near the edge of town, a place he had retreated to once Emily's family revoked his access to the estate. The conversation about the property rights lasted less than 5 minutes. The trustee read the clause aloud, and by the end of it, Mark understood the house, the land, the accounts tied to the property. None of it belonged to him. He was given 48 hours to collect his belongings. He left with 2 suitcases. Everything else stayed behind. Meanwhile, the bank began its own investigation. They opened every account Mark had touched, flagged transfers, reviewed camera footage, and interviewed staff. The tone shifted quickly from irregular activity to fraud case. It was no longer a matter of misunderstanding. It had become a compliance breach that demanded escalation. The hospital followed, issuing an ethics complaint, centered on the timing of the forged documents and the ICU incident. Administrators who had once greeted him at charity events now refused to say his name aloud. In a system where reputation determines access, Mark's collapse was swift. The calls stopped coming. The invitations vanished. People who once sought his approval now avoided him in hallways and elevators. Reputation dissolves faster than trust, and his disintegrated completely. I saw him one last time from a distance. He was walking along the side of the road, near the old bus station, snow clinging to his coat. His shoulders were hunched, his steps uneven, as if he were learning how to move through the world without the weight of the identity he'd spent years performing. He didn't see me, and I didn't call out to him. Some endings don't need words. That night, the first real snowstorm of the season swept across the city. The streets emptied, the wind rose, and the sky turned the kind of pale gray that only appears before a long winter. Through the window of my mother's house, I watched the flakes build into soft, quiet layers. Mark left our lives in that storm. No announcements, no apologies. Just a man stepping into the dark, carrying nothing but the consequences he created. And even then, even with everything settled on paper, I could feel it. This story was not finished. Someone else had been moving pieces behind him. Someone whose initials still waited at the bottom of a notebook page. Weeks passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. The crisis had ended, yet the weight of it still lingered in the halls of the hospital. Then, one early morning, as the sun broke through the blinds and thin lines, a nurse rushed to find me. Linda was awake. I walked into her room slowly. She looked fragile, her eyes still adjusting, her breath soft and careful. But she was here, present, and that alone felt like a second life handed back to us. When she saw me, she tried to smile, and I felt something inside me settle for the first time in weeks. I pulled a chair close and took her hand. The moment our fingers touched, something warm rose in my chest. She whispered my name, and I told her everything. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. Just steady, clear, piece by piece, the same way it had unfolded for me. Her eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from the shock of knowing how close everything had come to slipping away. She held my hand a little tighter, as if grounding herself. She didn't ask how Mark could have done it. She didn't ask why none of us saw it earlier. She only whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." When she was strong enough, we left the hospital together. We did not return to the big house, or the noise that came with it. Instead, we chose a small home near the lake, a place where mornings were quiet and the air felt clean. Life slowed down. Days began with soft light on the water and ended with long walks, gentle conversations, and a calm we had forgotten we needed. Sometimes in the evenings, she would sit beside me and ask if I ever thought about what happened, about how close we came to losing everything her parents worked for. I always told her the same thing. Greed can turn someone you trust into a stranger you never really knew. Truth and patience, when used at the right moment, can be stronger than force. And family, real family, is the one who stays when you are vulnerable and cannot stand alone. Even now, I still wonder, if the bank hadn't called that day, could everything have disappeared with one click? And how many families are living beside someone waiting for the same opportunity? Thank you for listening to our story. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, remember to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.